My name is Major Miranda Mason. I am 37 years old, a decorated officer in the United States Army forged by desert steel and the unrelenting noise of war. My life has been a battlefield of order strategies and the silence that follows when soldiers do not come back. I never thought my story would lead me to this stage, standing before my own family, facing a challenge crueler than combat. The hall was bathed in bright lights, filled with officers, veterans, and guests in formal attire. Polished boots clicked against the marble floors. The air smelled of brass and polish, heavy with expectation. I felt their eyes on me, curious, doubtful, and some even mocking. Then came Megan's voice, sharp and cutting through the whispers, a washed-up soldier at the piano. She said it with the same grin she had worn since childhood, a grin that told me she had already judged me. Her words echoed, feeding the quiet chuckles of a few guests who thought they understood my place in this room. My father, Mark Mason, stood a few feet away. He adjusted his tie, tilted his head, and delivered the blow he had waited years to repeat. "You'll never be a pianist, Miranda." His tone was cold, dismissive, filled with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned not only music, but my destiny. I did not look at them. I simply sat down, my uniform blending with the dark bench beneath me. My hands hovered above the keys, the same hands that had carried rifles, the same hands that had lifted wounded soldiers out of fire zones. There was silence, the kind of silence that thickens just before the first shot of a war. I pressed the first note. The sound, a pure E, cut through the tension like a blade. Silence followed, not the silence of disbelief, but of revelation. Then it happened. All 100 Navy SEALs, present men who had seen the worst of human cruelty, rose, as one, their chairs scraping against the floor like a synchronized salute. Their captain, a man with scars etched deep into his face, stepped forward and whispered, his voice breaking, "Oh God." That melody, I caught a glimpse of my father's face. His jaw was tight, his lips trembling, the color drained from his cheeks. Megan, who moments ago laughed, now sat frozen, her mouth slightly open. They were not just listening, they were unraveling. This was not a performance, it was a reckoning. One note, then another and another. The room, once filled with pride and arrogance, became mine. I was not the soldier they dismissed. I was the woman who could summon memories, pain, and hope with every chord. I thought of the countless nights when music was my only weapon, when I played under the dim light of a camp tent, to stop soldiers from shaking, to keep their nightmares at bay. This moment belonged to that same courage. For a brief second, I looked at my father and my sister. There was no laughter left, no scoff, no contempt. There was only the undeniable truth of sound, raw, powerful, and unshakable. I ended the phrase, letting the last note linger like smoke after gunfire. And in that silence, I knew something had shifted forever. I was once invisible, but from that moment on, every single person in this hall would have to listen. I am Major Miranda Mason. My path has never been gentle. The Army forged my mind and body, but music forged my soul. I have spent years fighting battles both on foreign soil and in the quiet corners of my own heart. I tell you this because what you just witnessed, the room of hardened SEALs rising to their feet, did not happen by chance. It happened because I learned that music is not just sound. It is a bridge between life and death, between despair and hope. There was a time when I believed my music had no place in the world my father built. Mark Mason, the man who once placed my tiny hands on ivory keys, became the very person who tried to silence me. His words, "You'll never be a pianist," were not just a casual insult. They were a verdict, one he repeated so many times that even I began to believe it. But war changes you. The battlefield strips away the falsehoods. I saw soldiers tremble, their hearts racing as infections and exhaustion tore through our camp during the Kazan 12 mission. There were no miracles, no promises of survival. All I had was an old keyboard, and the melody I had written years ago, a piece born from sleepless nights and aching memories. That melody became a lifeline. Each note was a breath, each chord a reminder that they were still alive. When the medicine ran out, when fear threatened to drown them, I played. And somehow they found the strength to hold on. This is why tonight matters. This is why I sat at that piano while my father and sister mocked me. Because that melody, the one that stopped a room of seals, is not just mine. It carries the voices of every soldier who fought to see another dawn. I looked at Captain Ford as he whispered, "Oh God, that melody." I saw the tears well in his eyes. He remembered as I did the night we thought none of us would make it. I glanced at my father again. This time I saw something break in him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was guilt, but I knew he could no longer deny what he had stolen from me years ago. This is only the beginning. The first note was not just music, it was the opening shot of a battle I had to fight, not with weapons, but with truth. The note that left the room speechless once saved lives on the battlefield. And now it will bring to light the betrayal of the man I once called my hero, because the melody that healed others was stolen from me. And tonight I am here to take it back. I grew up in a house where silence was louder than applause. My father, Mark Mason, was a music professor who never made it to the stage he believed he deserved. He taught counterpoint by day-graded papers at night and stared at the cracked ceiling between both, imagining a life that kept slipping out of reach. His piano was polished to a mirror sheen. His pride was too. What was not polished was the way he handled disappointment. He wrapped it in criticism and offered it to me as guidance. Megan, my older sister, was his reflection in temperament and in face. Tall, composed, always ready with a precise opinion. She could mimic his theories about structure and phrasing before dinner ended, and he would nod with a warm satisfaction I never earned. She did not love music the way I did. She loved being right about it. That was enough for him. I was 12 when I played the first piece that felt like mine, even though it was Chopin on the page. I remember the way the right hand floated over the melody, while the left anchored it, the way a slight delay on the dominant made room for breath. I remember the way the sound curled back toward me, like it trusted me. My father stood behind me, hands clasped, watching every finger. When I finished, the room stayed quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said it. "You will never be a pianist, Miranda. Not because you are not talented, but because talent without obedience is waste." He meant obedience to him, to his rules, to his limitations. That sentence lodged somewhere in me. It did not break me, it calibrated me. I learned to stop asking him to listen. I learned to play when the house slept, to write melodies in pencil and hide them in geometry books. Megan would smirk when she caught me composing. "Dad sees through pretenders," she would say, and she was sure she was offering me a kindness by delivering his judgments early. Still, there were nights he would stop by my door and linger, thinking I did not notice. I could hear him breathing, hear his sleeve brush the door frame. That was the strangest part. He loved music enough to hear what I could be. He feared failure enough to make sure I never got there without him. That tension defined our home love, braided with envy, teaching braided with theft. He would praise Megan for her essays on aesthetics. He would mark my scores with red ink for dynamics he could not feel. When I enlisted, he called it a waste. When I was commissioned, he called it a detour. When I was deployed, he sent me a single-line email. "Try not to forget the piano." I did not forget. I packed the memory of his sentence with my uniform. I carried it into a world where men bled out on sand, where music had nothing to do with applause, and everything to do with keeping a heart from racing off a cliff. The first time I wrote something of my own, truly my own, I did what daughters do when they still believe their fathers can protect them. I sent it to him. That choice would cost me more than any battlefield. But that is later. For now, I was 12 again, hearing the verdict that would follow me from the practice room to the front line. "You will never be a pianist." My hands disagreed. My life would teach them how to prove it. The desert was not supposed to echo with music, yet it did. We called it Kazan 12, a forward operating site, carved out of dust wire and stubborn belief. It started with a cough in one tent and spread like a rumor no one could shut down. The pharmacy shelves ran dry. We rationed antibiotics, then painkillers, then saline. Men who could sprint under artillery fire could no longer climb from cot to cot without gasping. Their eyes searched for certainty. We did not have any. On the fourth night, after 2 body bags and a third soldier delirious from fever, I did something I had not planned. I brought in a cheap keyboard from a supply crate, labeled recreational. It was out of tune on the lower and stiff on the top like old ivory that forgot it was supposed to sing. I wiped it down with alcohol pads and plugged it into a generator that coughed worse than the men. The medics gave me the kind of look you give someone who just announced they will pray the bullets away. I understood. Then I asked them to trust me. I chose a key that sat comfortably in the breath. E, not too sharp, not too warm. I matched the tempo to the rise and fall of one soldier's chest. Inhale for 2 counts. Hold for 1 exhale for 4. Over and over. I wrote a counterline above it, soft and repetitive, like the hand a mother places on a back at 2 in the morning. I told them to follow me. Some tried. Some cursed. Some cried. After 20 minutes, blood pressure stabilized in 2 of the worst cases. Respiration normalized in 3. The medics started keeping time on clipboards, nodding silently with each exhale that struck the downbeat. Someone fell asleep, really asleep, the first real sleep in days. A young corporal woke up and asked who turned off the helicopter sounds. There had not been any helicopters. Only fever fear, and now a melody cutting through both. That is when I understood it. Music was not decoration. It was triage for the spirit. It organized panic. It gave the body something mathematical to trust when biology was failing. The men stopped shaking when the second motif entered because their minds found a pattern to hold on to. The worst of them, a senior petty officer with tremors so violent, he bit through his lip, began to breathe with the lower line. He mouthed the counts. He said thank you without sound. When the contagion passed and the medicine caught up, Colonel Ford wrote in his after-action report that my intervention with the keyboard contributed to controlling group panic and stabilizing respirations during critical shortage. It was the most clinical way to say something that felt like a miracle. I kept the keyboard. The keys were sticky from sweat and tears. I cleaned it and wrapped it like a weapon. From that point forward, the melody was no longer mine alone. It belonged to the men who survived those nights. It belonged to the nurses who counted the beats on their fingers when machines went dark. It belonged to the ones we could not keep, the ones whose last seconds were measured not in pain, but in steady rhythm. I guarded it fiercely. I did not know yet that I would have to fight my own father to keep it. I only knew that if anyone ever tried to take that music away, they would be stealing more than notes on a page. They would be stealing proof that in a place where nothing was certain, we found a way to breathe together and live. The melody that had carried us through those fevered nights would not let me sleep either. Back at the base, when operations slowed and the desert winds quieted down, I spent my evenings sketching it out. I called it Nocturne for those who don't sleep. It was more than notes. It was a memory written in minor chords and aching intervals. Each line had its own story, each pause, a breath taken by a soldier who refused to give up. I wrote it with a kind of urgency, as if finishing it would somehow make all the pain we had endured mean something. But when I read it over, I felt I was missing something. Not technically, but emotionally. My father, for all his flaws, had an ear for nuance. Part of me, a naive part that still wanted his approval, thought he would help me bring the Nocturne to life. One evening, I scanned the handwritten score and attached it to an email. I wrote, Dad, I'd like your feedback. This piece means a lot to me. It kept people alive when there was nothing left to hold on to. I think you'll understand what I was trying to say. I hit send before I could overthink it. He replied in 2 lines the next day, promising. I'll see what I can do, that was it. No warmth, no curiosity about where this melody came from. I convinced myself that his silence was just his way of concentrating. A month later, while I was back on U.S. soil, my phone buzzed with a message from a former piano student of his. Your dad's piece is brilliant. The whole department is talking about it. I stared at the text. I did not have a new piece out. My blood ran cold. I found the article online. Mark Mason unveils new nocturne, a tribute to sleepless souls. There it was, my work, my title, my heartbeat on paper, except his name stood where mine should have been. He had cleaned it up, added some ornamental phrasing, and called it his own creation. The music world, small as it was, praised him. His colleagues wrote about his return to form. They said this was the piece that would put him back on the map. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call every critic and tell them the truth. But when I confronted him, he simply said, "Miranda, you sent it to me. I shaped it. You should be proud that our family name is attached to something this beautiful." His voice was calm, as if logic could erase theft. I was fresh off a deployment, my hands trembling, not from anger, but from lingering tremors of combat stress. I was tired, raw, and still haunted by the faces of those we had lost. I did not have the strength to wage a personal war. My uniform carried ribbons for courage, but at home I felt small. So I stayed silent. I let him take the credit. And each congratulatory article that mentioned him felt like a bullet grazing my skin. I told myself it did not matter that I wrote the piece for the soldiers, not for recognition. But deep down, I knew something sacred had been stolen. It was not about fame. It was about truth. And the truth had been buried under my father's ambition, just like every time he told me I would never be enough. The day I saw the sheet music published under his name, I felt something inside me fracture. It was not just betrayal. It was the realization that he had been waiting for this chance, the moment when my guard was down, to prove his voice mattered more than mine. I remember standing in the small kitchen of my rented apartment, the desert dust still on my boots. I had just returned from months of deployment, my mind split between relief and grief. Then I saw the framed newspaper clipping my mother had mailed me, the one where his smiling face stood next to my title. She wrote in neat handwriting, "So proud of your father." I wanted to tear it to pieces. That night I sat on the floor staring at the piano keys, my hands refusing to play. Every chord reminded me of him. Every note carried the weight of his words. "You'll never be a pianist." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a soldier pretending to belong in the world of music. But as days turned into weeks, the anger sharpened into something more durable. I replayed the nights in Kazan 12, the way the men breathed in rhythm with me, the way their fear eased when the nocturne found them. That music was born from blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. He had not been there. He had not seen their faces. I thought about fighting him legally. I even drafted an email to a lawyer, but I deleted it before hitting send. I did not have the mental strength to start a public battle while still battling my own nightmares. I convinced myself that staying silent was the brave choice, that the music did not need my name to live on. Then the invitation came, a gold-embossed card addressed to Major Miranda Mason, inviting me to a ceremony honoring Mark Mason for his contributions to music and the composition that captured the resilience of modern soldiers. I read the words twice, my pulse hammering. He was being celebrated not just as a musician, but as the voice of the very people my melody had saved. I felt something click inside me. It was the same clarity I felt before every mission, that cold focus where fear steps aside to make room for purpose. If he thought I would stand quietly in that audience clapping for a man who stole the one thing I had poured my soul into, he was wrong. If he believed the daughter he had silenced for years would stay silent again, he had forgotten who taught me to fight. I folded the invitation, placed it on the piano, and whispered to myself, if he thinks I will watch from the shadows again, he is wrong. That ceremony would not be his triumph. It would be the moment my truth walked onto the stage. The hall was dressed for grandeur. Flags hung in perfect symmetry, their colors vibrant under the soft glow of chandeliers. Rows of polished wooden chairs filled the space, each occupied by decorated officers, Navy SEALs in crisp uniforms, and donors dressed in formal evening wear. The air buzzed with the scent of polished leather and the faint metallic tang of anticipation. This was no ordinary ceremony. It was meant to honor courage, resilience, and the music that had carried soldiers through the edge of despair. I walked in my dress uniform, immaculate, each medal glinting beneath the lights. Yet I felt like an outsider in a room meant for applause. My father stood at the podium, his posture proud, his silver hair combed meticulously. He looked every inch the celebrated composer he now pretended to be. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice rich and smooth tonight. We celebrate not just music, but the spirit of perseverance. This composition, Nocturne for Those Who Don't Sleep, was born from my reflections on the resilience of our soldiers. His eyes swept across the room as if blessing the crowd with his words. When his gaze brushed mine, there was a glint of triumph, like he had already won a battle I did not know I was fighting. I sat silently, my hands resting on my lap, fingers curling into fists beneath the white gloves. Each word he spoke was a knife twisting deeper. He described how he imagined the pulse of soldiers under duress, and how he translated their bravery into melody. He was painting a portrait of himself as the savior of a world he had never stepped foot in. Megan sat beside him, her smile practiced and sharp. When the crowd applauded, she glanced back at me with that same smirk she had worn when we were children, as if to say, "This is his stage, not yours." Inside, I felt heat crawl up my spine. I remembered the coughing fits in Kazan 12, the way the nocturne grew out of desperation, out of fear, out of love for my men who clung to life by a thread. He was speaking as though he had lived those nights, when in truth he had only stolen them. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to shout the truth, but I stayed still. There would be a better moment to act, and I would seize it. I could feel the weight of my soldiers' eyes on me from across the hall. Some of the SEALs I had served with were here lined in perfect formation, their faces serious, but their presence loud enough to steady me. I looked up at my father one last time. He was lost in his own praise, the applause feeding his ego like fuel to a flame. He had no idea that the silence brewing within me was not defeat. It was strategy. When the speeches concluded, the host of the ceremony stepped forward. To honor this extraordinary composition, he announced, "We will now hear a live performance." My heart pounded. I had not been told there would be a performance tonight. My father, smiling with the confidence of a man who thought he owned the moment, approached the grand piano placed at the center of the stage. Before he could sit, a voice cut through the quiet. Major Mason Colonel Ford said from his seat near the front row. His voice carried the authority of a commander and the warmth of a man who knew what that melody meant. "Would you do us the honor of playing this piece? After all, you were the one who played it for my men in Kazan 12. The room turned toward me. My father froze mid-step, his face betraying a flicker of unease. Megan leaned toward him, whispering something with a chuckle, then turned to me with a voice dipped in venom. "You please. You're just a soldier past her prime." Her words hit the room like a slap, drawing a few uneasy murmurs. My father's voice followed, calm but dismissive. "Miranda, these people came to hear a pianist, not a soldier pretending to be one." I rose slowly. The tension in the air tightened like a drawn bowstring. I looked at Colonel Ford, at the men who had once laid in fevered silence, while I played the only notes I could muster. I owed them this moment. "Let her play," Ford said again, his tone leaving no room for debate. I walked past my father, my boots clicking against the stage floor. His expression was frozen between anger and disbelief. Megan laughed under her breath, shaking her head like she already knew I would fail. I sat down at the piano, my hands hovered above the keys. I felt every gaze on me, every doubt, every whisper. My heart slowed to match the rhythm I had once taught the soldiers: inhale, for 2 hold, for 1 exhale, for 4. Then I pressed the first note. Silence followed, not the silence of ridicule, but of recognition. The E rang out like the opening line of a confession. It was not just a sound. It was a memory, a lifeline. The murmurs stopped. The entire hall seemed to exhale. The melody flowed from my fingers like water breaking through a dam. Each note carried the weight of sleepless nights, of whispered prayers under a starless sky. I closed my eyes and let my hands guide the room through the same journey I had taken with my men. The SEALs shifted in their seats. One by one they stood up as if drawn by an invisible thread. 100 men, battle-hardened and scarred, now stood at attention, their eyes fixed not on the stage, but on the memory this music pulled from them. The captain's breath caught audibly. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Oh God, that melody." I glanced up briefly, just enough to see the ripple of emotion spreading through the crowd. Some donors wiped their eyes, confused by the sudden lump in their throats. Others simply stared, spellbound. The music had found them all, but the most telling reaction was my father's. He sat frozen, his jaw tight, his face pale. He recognized what he was hearing. He recognized the nuances, the details, the subtle heartbeat I had woven into the piece, details no one but the true composer would know. Beside him, Megan's smirk evaporated. She looked from me to him, her eyes narrowing with questions she had never thought to ask. The hall was no longer his domain. It belonged to the truth vibrating from the strings. I reached the bridge of the nocturne, the part that mimicked the breathing pattern of the sick soldiers, and I felt the room shift again. Those who knew the story behind it, Ford and his men, understood. They were reliving those nights, but now without fear, only gratitude. When the last chord hung in the air, I lifted my hands, but did not bow. I did not need to. The silence that followed was deafening, a silence full of realization and respect. In that moment, I knew I had reclaimed something more valuable than applause. I had reclaimed my voice, my story, my father's stolen truth. That night, justice began to awaken. The applause from the ceremony still echoed in my ears as I walked off the stage that night. It was not victory, it was only the opening shot. I knew my father. He would not sit quietly after being unmasked, even if no one had spoken the truth aloud. His pride would make him fight harder, and I had to be ready. I started gathering every piece of evidence that could prove the nocturne was mine. I dug through the hard drive I had carried through deployments. There it was, the original MIDI file of Nocturne for Those Who Don't Sleep, saved with the timestamp from the Desert Camp's generator laptop. Every note matched the piece he had published under his name. I found the email I sent him attached with the scanned manuscript, my signature still visible in the bottom corner of the sheet. For days, I traced every digital footprint. The recordings from Kazan 12 were still stored in a backup folder, the voices of the medics faintly audible in the background. I burned them onto a disk. Each document felt like a bullet I would eventually fire, not to wound but to expose the truth. When I confronted him again, he was ready. "You're making a mistake, Miranda," he said, leaning back in his chair, his tone smooth but sharp. "Do you think anyone will believe a soldier who has been through combat stress over a respected academic like me?" He smirked as if he already knew the answer. 2 days later, I received a legal notice. He had hired a high-profile attorney, someone known for crushing defamation cases before they even reached court. The letter accused me of attempting to slander his reputation, claiming I was mentally unstable due to war trauma and unable to distinguish reality from fiction. Reading those words was like swallowing glass. Megan's name appeared on the witness list. She was to testify that our father had always been the composer that I had fantasized about being a musician. I called her, my hands trembling. "Megan, you know the truth," I said, my voice raw. "You saw me write that nocturne. You saw me send it to him." There was a pause. "Miranda," she finally replied, "Dad has given everything to music. He deserves this chance. Don't ruin it." Her tone was cold, but beneath it I sensed fear. Fear of losing his approval. Fear of stepping out of the shadow she had always depended on. That night I stared at the stack of evidence on my desk. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. But this was not just about me anymore. It was about the men who had breathed through that melody, about the truth that deserved to be heard. I swore to myself I would not back down, even if it meant tearing apart what little family I had left. The days leading up to the first legal hearing felt heavier than any deployment I had ever been on. I found myself replaying the nights in Kazan 12, the fevered faces of soldiers lying under thin blankets, their bodies trembling as the infection spread. I could still see the way they looked at me when I sat at that broken keyboard, my hands shaking, trying to summon enough strength to play. One night I called Captain Ford. His voice was steady, as if the years had not dulled his memory of that place. "Major Mason," he said, "I'll testify. We all will if you need us. We know what that music did for us. We're alive because of it." Hearing him say that stirred something deep in me. It was no longer about my father's betrayal. It was about honoring the ones who had trusted me when the world collapsed around them. I compiled witness statements from the medics and soldiers who had survived the outbreak. They recalled how the nocturne's slow rhythm helped them regulate their breathing, how it distracted them from the pain long enough for the fever to break. One of the nurses described it as a lifeline in sound. Another soldier wrote, "When Major Mason played, I believed for the first time that I might see home again." My father's legal team responded with polished confidence. They dismissed these accounts as emotional exaggerations and misremembered events. They tried to shift the narrative, painting me as a woman seeking validation through stolen acclaim. Reading their statements made my blood boil. But I had more than stories. I had facts. I had the time-stamped MIDI file, the original handwritten score, and the email chain proving he received my draft. I even had a recording from a medic's phone where my voice could be heard counting the tempo as I played. Still, the pressure mounted. Megan's silence was the hardest blow. She would not answer my calls anymore. Her loyalty to our father seemed absolute, and I could not understand how she could stand by while he erased my name from the very thing I created. The night before the hearing, I sat alone at my piano. My fingers traced the keys but did not press them. I whispered to myself, "This melody is more than music. It is memory, it is survival, it is mine." I could feel the weight of every soldier's breath in those notes. The echo of Kazan 12, pulsing through me like blood. I was ready. The legal battle would not just be about proving ownership. It would be about reclaiming my voice, about telling the world who I truly was and what I had endured. The first court date was set. My father would be there, polished and confident, ready to paint me as broken. But I had something he did not: the truth and the strength of those who had lived because of my music. The conflict was no longer just a fight for recognition. It was a fight for justice. The courtroom was cold, lit by the sterile brightness of overhead lamps. The polished wooden benches were filled with spectators, journalists, military representatives, and a few familiar faces from the SEAL unit. I stood behind my lawyer, the weight of my uniform like armor, though. Inside, I could feel the tremor of anticipation. My father sat on the opposite side, his suit pressed, his expression crafted to perfection. His lawyer, a tall man with a predatory calm, opened with a statement designed to cut me down before I could speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what we have here is not theft, but confusion. My client, Professor Mark Mason, is a respected composer. His daughter, though undoubtedly brave in her military service, suffers from post-traumatic stress. She has misremembered events, and now believes she wrote a piece of music that, in truth, was entirely her father's work." Every word made me clench my jaw tighter. My father nodded along his face, arranged in solemn disappointment, as if I were the one tarnishing the family name. Then they unveiled their evidence, a printed manuscript bearing his annotations. Backdated emails they claimed proved he had begun the composition months before I sent him my file. It was a carefully constructed lie, designed to undermine my credibility. When it was my turn, I rose slowly. My lawyer handed me the flash drive containing my proof. I approached the judge's desk, my boots echoing against the tile floor. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is the original MIDI file of Nocturne for Those Who Don't Sleep, saved on a military-issued laptop during the Kazan 12 mission. It carries a timestamp, a digital fingerprint that predates any document my father has shown." The judge leaned forward as the technical expert plugged the flash drive into a computer. The screen lit up with my file, the metadata scrolling down. "Date created April 17th, 0200 hours UTC," the expert read aloud. My father's lawyer stiffened, but I wasn't finished. I also have this, I said, producing a small recorder. A field recording from the medical tent. You can hear the men breathing in time with the melody, and you can hear my voice counting, guiding them through each measure. The recording played, filling the courtroom with the faint hum of the keyboard, the labored breathing of soldiers, and my own voice saying 2, hold, 4, again. A silence swept across the room. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, some wiping their eyes. My father looked down at his hands, his mask cracking for the first time. I felt no triumph, only a grim clarity. I had not come here to humiliate him, but the truth was stripping away every illusion he had built. Then, just when I thought the silence might settle like dust, Megan stood up. My heart skipped a beat. She had been silent for weeks, aligned with my father, ready to testify against me. But now her hands trembled as she pulled a small USB drive from her purse. "Your Honor," she said, her voice shaking, "I have something to add." The courtroom stirred. My father's lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised a hand. "Proceed." Megan walked forward, each step heavier than the last. She did not look at our father. Her eyes found mine, wide and uncertain, but filled with something I hadn't seen since we were children: courage. "This USB," she continued, "contains a scanned copy of Miranda's original handwritten score. I saved it on my laptop years ago, the night she sent it to Dad. I didn't think much of it then. But I can't keep pretending." I felt my breath hitch. Megan had always been the loyal one, the perfect daughter who echoed our father's every word. For her to stand here defying him meant the cracks in his lies had reached her heart too. The judge examined the files from her USB. My father's face turned pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Megan," he said, his voice raw. "You don't understand." "No, Dad," she cut him off, her voice breaking. "I do understand. I've been quiet all my life, but this is wrong. Miranda wrote that music. I saw her write it. I saw her send it to you." His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked smaller somehow, as though the truth had shrunk him, pulled him down from the pedestal he had built for himself. The spectators whispered among themselves. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with awe. My lawyer placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, but I kept my gaze on Megan. I gave her the smallest nod of gratitude. The final moments of the hearing felt like the slow roll of a storm about to break. The judge reviewed the evidence, flipping through pages and digital files with careful deliberation. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. When the verdict came, it landed like a weight lifted from my chest. The court recognizes Major Miranda Mason as the sole author of Nocturne for Those Who Don't Sleep. All royalties and associated rights are to be transferred to her name. Additionally, by the request of Major Mason, a portion of these funds will be directed toward a foundation supporting veterans' rehabilitation programs. Applause erupted softly, starting with the SEALs in the back row. Some of them stood saluting me with quiet pride. My father sat motionless, his face a mixture of disbelief and something far more fragile: regret. I approached him after the ruling. For years I had waited for an apology that never came. Now I did not need it, but I wanted to hear it once, even if it was whispered. He looked at me, his eyes wet, his voice hoarse. "Miranda, I'm sorry. I let my fear of being forgotten drive me to hurt you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that." I held his gaze, my own heart conflicted. I could see the man who once placed my hands on the keys, teaching me my first scales. "This isn't just about me," I said quietly. "It's about the truth. And now, it's done." Megan stepped closer, her hand brushing mine. "I should have spoken up sooner," she murmured. I nodded, understanding that this moment was as much her liberation as mine. As I left the courtroom, I felt lighter, as though the weight of years had been peeled away. But I also knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of something bigger, a chance to use this music, this story, to heal more than just myself. That day, justice was not just declared, it was felt. The verdict did not end the story, it detonated it in public. Opinion columns multiplied overnight. Some writers called my father a thief who preyed on the gifts of his own child. Others, more careful or more sentimental, argued that he was a broken man who panicked at the thought of dying in obscurity. They asked if the court of public empathy should weigh as heavily as the court of law. A talk radio host framed it as a generational war between a daughter shaped by combat and a father shaped by academic failure. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Was forgiveness a virtue or a luxury? Did trauma excuse deception? Did achievement justify cruelty? People debated me as if I were an allegory, not a person. I refused every interview. I did not go on television to cry or to rage. I issued one statement written in precise, unemotional language. I affirmed the court's decision. I confirmed that the royalties would be redirected to a veterans' rehabilitation fund. I acknowledged my father's apology. Then I made my condition public. If he wanted any part of redemption, he would contribute his future income from teaching, consulting, and publishing to the same fund. He would correct the academic record in every venue that had printed his name over mine. No negotiation, no softening. Critics accused me of humiliation disguised as philanthropy. Others said I was too lenient. They wanted me to ruin him. I understood both impulses. I chose neither. What I chose was structure. Pain without structure curdles into vengeance. Justice with structure becomes repair. Privately, my father wrote to me. The email was long, uncharacteristically vulnerable. He admitted he had watched my career with a mixture of admiration and terror. He said the day I sent him the nocturne, he felt like a ghost. He panicked. He tried to claim it as proof that he still mattered. He said he would comply with every condition and more. He asked if he could attend one of the group therapy sessions the fund would support, not as a patient, but as a listener who needed to learn how to be useful. I did not answer right away. Instead, I spoke to the board managing the fund and asked them to treat him like any other contributor or volunteer. No special access, no gentle language. Let his restitution be unremarkable, steady, and public. Let the correction live longer than the applause for the lie. Meanwhile, journalists kept circling. They wanted the intimate version, the tearful reconciliation, or the explosive estrangement. I gave them neither. My silence began to irritate them. That was fine. The truth had already been printed in the only place that mattered, the ruling and the ledger of the fund. The first disbursement went to an underfunded clinic specializing in trauma-informed music therapy for veterans with respiratory comorbidities, many of whom could barely sleep without mechanical support. The director sent me a note that said simply, "Your nocturne will be taught here as a protocol, not a performance." I read it twice and felt something in me finally loosen. At a small community forum, a woman stood up and asked me if I could ever really forgive him. I told her forgiveness was not the currency I traded in anymore. Accountability was. I said I was not God, not a saint, not a judge beyond the one who signed the order. I was a daughter who learned to survive by naming things correctly. My father had stolen. Now he was paying. Whether he could one day be whole was his work, not my burden. The debate would rage on with or without me. But from that moment forward, the center of gravity shifted away from spectacle and toward the fund's work. That was the point. I had not fought to win applause or to make sure my father lost everything. I fought to make sure what was taken from me would be converted into something that could not be taken from others. Access treatment proof that art can keep people alive when medicine is late. Megan showed up at the foundation office on a Tuesday morning without makeup and without the practiced composure she wore like a suit of armor. She asked for a volunteer form. She did not ask to sit on the board or to claim expertise. She asked where the filing cabinets were and how the intake system worked. For the first month, she sorted receipts, logged donations, and answered phones. When a caller tried to bait her into talking about our father, she said, "The fund is about veterans, not the Mason family," and hung up. I watched her from my office window, unsure whether to thank her or to leave her alone. Eventually, I chose the middle path. I sent her a short note, "I see you. Keep going." She slipped it into her wallet and never mentioned it. My father's transformation was quieter and riskier. He took a part-time position at a community arts center in a neighborhood that never buys season tickets to symphonies. He taught basic piano to children whose parents worked double shifts. He also started a free seminar for veterans who wanted to reclaim instruments they had abandoned after deployment. He did not put his name on posters. He submitted invoices to the fund as required, then immediately signed them back over as donations. When the local paper tried to run a profile on him as the fallen genius rebuilding his life, he declined the interview and asked them to highlight the center instead. The editor called me frustrated. I told her to write about the kids. She did. The donations tripled that week. One evening late, I visited one of his classes unannounced. I stood in the doorway and listened. He was teaching a middle-aged Marine how to keep a steady left hand, while the right played a four-note melody. The Marine kept apologizing for his mistakes. My father said softly, "Mistakes are proof you're trying to speak again. Keep speaking." The words caught in my chest. They were the words I had needed when I was 12. He had finally found them decades too late. Still, they were true. After class, he saw me. He did not approach. He waited for me to decide. I walked to the edge of the piano, rested my hand on the lid, and said, "The fund received your last transfer. Thank you." He nodded. "If you ever need someone to tune the instruments at the clinic, I can do that. Quiet work suits me now." I said I would let the staff know. We stood in an honest silence, not the cold kind we grew up with, but the kind that acknowledges damage and leaves room for repair. Megan kept climbing not to power, but to purpose. She developed a small program inside the fund that paired young composers with veterans' narratives under strict ethics guidelines to prevent the kind of theft our family had lived through. She wrote those guidelines herself: consent, credit, compensation, and community review. When a donor praised her brilliance, she corrected him. "It is not brilliance. It is debt repayment. Redemption is not a banner you wave. It is a spreadsheet reconciled at the end of every month. It is a class taught in a room that smells like cheap soap and hope. It is a sister alphabetizing intake folders until midnight." People wanted a cinematic embrace, a triumphant family reunion. What they got instead was steady work. That is how adults make amends. By the end of the year, the Nocturne had paid for 5 new therapy programs, 2 research studies on respiratory regulation and music, and a scholarship for veterans pursuing creative arts degrees. My father's name appeared beneath mine on a single document, a published correction in the academic journal that first printed his lie. He requested that placement. The editor asked me if I approved. I did. Let history show it exactly as it happened. One night, as I closed the office, Megan sent me a text: "Dad is tuning the clinic's upright tomorrow. Do you want to be there?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed, "No, but tell him the A above middle C is drifting sharp." She replied, "He already noticed." I smiled, locked the door, and stepped into the quiet street. The melody that once broke a room into silence now funded the rebuilding of lives. That was the only ending I ever wanted. I sat at the upright in the group therapy room, the one my father now tuned on Thursdays. The walls were soft blue, the kind chosen to make breathing easier. A whiteboard listed the week's goals: regulate, reframe, reconnect. A dozen veterans circled the piano in folding chairs, their bodies telling different versions of the same story. Stiff shoulders, cautious eyes, hands that flexed when the room grew too quiet. I placed my fingers on the keys and felt the wood vibrate under the weight of what the melody had become. "This is the piece we used in Kazan." 12, I said, my voice level. "It is not here to stir your trauma. It is here to give your breath something to hold." I asked them to listen to the first bar. Then I asked them to breathe with it. Inhale for 2, hold for 1, exhale for 4. Again, again, again. The room shifted as bodies found rhythm. Panic is noise. Music, when you use it carefully, is structure. I began the Nocturne not as a performance, but as a protocol. The lower register settled first, setting the pace. The right hand floated not to impress, but to soothe. A sergeant with a scar running through his eyebrow closed his eyes and counted silently on his fingers. A Navy corpsman pressed his palm over his chest and unclenched his jaw. Across the circle, a woman who had not spoken in 2 sessions lifted her head for the first time and watched my hands like she was reading a language she almost remembered. Captain Ford sat near the back, arms folded not as a commander, but as a witness. When we reached the bridge, the breathing pattern encoded into melody, his eyes glistened. After we finished, he said quietly, "I remember the night we learned to breathe together. I remember thinking we might see morning if we could just follow you for one more measure." His voice broke on measure. He cleared his throat, sat back, and listened to the air settle. I told the group what I had learned the hard way. Music is not here to win. It is not here to prove anyone wrong. It is not here to make heroes. It is here to heal one regulated breath at a time. It is not revenge. It is repair. Heads nodded not because the line was beautiful, but because it landed where it needed to. When the session ended, a young Marine approached me and asked if he could have a copy of the left-hand pattern to play on a cheap keyboard in his garage. I printed it from the clinic computer and wrote, "Start where you can. Tempo is a promise, not a race." He thanked me, folded the paper with the care of a field map, and slipped it into his wallet. I packed the sheet music, pressed the piano lid down gently, and looked around the room. No applause, no ovations, only the meaningful quiet of people who had made it through another hour. That is the legacy I wanted, not fame, not vindication, but rooms like this where a melody turns fear into something you can count and survive. I left the therapy room last, turning off the lights one by one, until only the glow from the hallway spilled across the fallboard. I pressed a single E before closing it, the same E that once stunned a hall full of uniforms and tore the truth from hiding. It rang out softly, not as a battle cry, but as a benediction. That note closed a chapter I thought would never end. In the corridor, I paused at the clinic's bulletin board. Flyers for breathing workshops, legal clinics, music therapy schedules, and Megan's ethics guidelines for collaborative composition were pinned in neat columns. At the bottom was a note in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for helping my dad sleep." There was a crayon drawing of a keyboard under it, the keys slightly uneven but all present. I smiled. Completeness does not require perfection. I stepped outside into the cool evening. The city hummed indifferent and alive. I thought about my father in the practice room across town, tuning another old upright setting, every A to its proper frequency, 1/4 turn at a time. Justice, I had learned, is rarely loud. It is calibrated, corrected, and carried forward by quiet hands. People still ask me if I forgave him. I tell them forgiveness is not a headline, it is a ledger. He pays, we build. The fund grows, the clinics multiply. The children learn, the veterans breathe. That is the only math I need. I walked to my car with nothing left to prove. The nocturne had been returned to its rightful name, but more importantly, it had become something larger than me. A tool, a lifeline, a structure of hope, repeated until it sticks. Justice does not make you young again. It does not erase the years of doubt or the nights spent staring at a ceiling you wish would answer you. Justice returns the right name to what is yours, and then it asks you what you plan to do with it. I answered the only way I knew how. I turned it into a way for others to breathe. I looked back at the clinic doors, now locked for the night. Somewhere inside, the last note still drifted through the air. Somewhere in another room, a veteran held to a metronome and slept. That was enough. Before we say goodbye, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. If this story reached you, consider subscribing. Not only to hear more, but to join a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for giving me your time today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this melody with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits patient and steady until you are ready to open your heart. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.